good time. And you know what? You're right.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
Tonight, Eye on America, how a camp is helping kids break their family's cycle of addiction. Then, President Biden calls for sweeping reforms to the Supreme Court. And how accurate is a new blood test to detect colon cancer on the CBS Evening News.
Idea that wealthy individuals, many of them right-wing, can both pay for cases before the court and at the same time give justices gifts or trips is outrageous.
Yeah, there should be terms.
Why?
That just, people sit in there too long, then you get too old.
She's going to make that decision probably in the next 6-7 days. I would imagine we'll know who her running mate is.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We'll see what happens. Will Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer be the pick or not? But meanwhile, surrogates for Vice President Kamala Harris, the presumptive Democratic nominee, busy campaigning today as vice presidential contenders stump from Pennsylvania to Michigan. All this while former President Donald Trump's VP pick, Ohio Senator JD Vance, you know he's been facing scrutiny for those past comments discussing childless Americans and political leadership, among other things. We'll get to all that later. But let's begin with President Biden. He's in the news today proposing major reforms to the U.S. Supreme Court, usually a sleepy time in the summer. No longer for the court. They're in the spotlight. President Biden proposing term limits for justices and an enforceable code of conduct. The administration also proposing a constitutional amendment that dictates no immunity for crimes for a former president committed while in office. To discuss all of this, especially President Biden's latest agenda, Finn Gomez and Weijia Jiang join us now. Great to have both of you here. Weijia, I want to begin with you. Supreme Court reform. The president seems adamant about doing this. The White House throwing a lot of weight behind it politically. But what's the real talk among your sources about what's possible at this point?
Robert, all you have to do is look at what's required to reform any of these measures that the president is putting forth to understand, especially our viewers should know this as well, that it is highly unlikely that any of them would pass because it would require congressional action, either in the form of legislation or ratifying the Constitution. So the president does not have any kind of unilateral authority to do this, and the White House is well aware of that. But that doesn't mean that this effort isn't useful to Biden and, frankly, Vice President Harris, who also issued a statement to say that she supported the president's plan because they can use this to really gin up enthusiasm and energy among their base, which has already had questions about the current state of the court. And so even though it is unlikely, in fact, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said that this would be dead on arrival in the House, we should expect them to push this from now until November to point out their argument that it is corrupt, that it needs to be reformed, and that, you know, a Harris administration would push for that even more. But, Robert, as you very well know, in terms of Congress passing this, you know, it's really not a reality.
We just stay with us. Finn Gomez here at the table with us. Finn, the president at the LBJ Library. I don't know. Have you been there? I've been there as a reporter. Austin, Texas, great city. But a lot of history.
I've actually never been there. Yeah, actually.
It's near UT.
Yeah.
And so much history with LBJ. His own decision, March 1968, to not seek the Democratic nomination. President Biden going there today. Andrew Young, who I sat down with in Atlanta a few months ago, the former ambassador for Jimmy Carter, civil rights leader. He'll be there introducing the president. What do you make of this moment for President Biden?
It's an historical crucial moment for President Biden. I think the parallels that you just talked about, going back to the 1968 election, where it was seen as the selfless act by LBJ not to run in that very heated political cycle. You see a lot of that mirrored now, and I'm sure you yourself have some great assessment on that as well. You do have the historical archival mind, Bob.
Well, it's just interesting to see President Biden out there, and it's notable that he's out at a presidential library. He's not just at some rally or some random site. He's at a presidential library. What do you make of it?
Yeah, this is not necessarily a campaign event, even though you could say the lines are blurred for all the White House events. But this is an official event in the capacity of President of the United States. And so he is continuing the argument, much of what we saw from the Oval Office, which you can't get more presidential than that, Robert, about, his belief that there is a threat to democracy here. And so that is why he is pushing for exactly what you're seeing on the screen. No immunity for crimes for a former president committed in office, the term limits and the code of conduct that is enforceable, we should point out, which is what he is pushing for. So it is certainly relevant, important that he chose this space to deliver these remarks.
Well, and Finn, when LBJ left in 1968, he had to kind of cede the political ground to his vice president, who eventually became the nominee, Hubert Humphrey. Now Vice President Harris is in this moment. She needs to pick a running mate as the president continues with his own agenda, working with the vice president on policy, but she has to choose a running mate in the campaign. We saw Gretchen Whitmer at the top of the show on CBS Mornings talking about her latest book, True Gretch. I've heard she's not at the top of the list. Who is at the top of the list based on your latest conversations with the Harris campaign?
Yeah, it's a little bit like when you look at the Veep stakes, and again, like going back to the 1968 model, the president at that time was clearing the lane for the best advantage that the party has, and I think right now that is at the top of the assessment list, if you will, for the Harris campaign.
What are you hearing?
Like essentially, he's like, okay, so it's still that Whitmer, interestingly enough, is still on the list. Even though what she said this morning, I know you have some good sources there also, but she is still on the list. Andy Beshear is still on the list, being told. Roy Cooper, Josh Shapiro, and of course Mark Kelly, the Arizona senator that we have heard a lot about in recent days, especially because of his bio. Especially he comes from a battleground state. We've been hearing very similar things about Josh Shapiro as well. But right now they're looking to assess to get the best possible team. They're telling me to help. They think defeat Trump, Vance. They feel they're in a good spot right now. They have the momentum, not only in money, but also with just the unity you're seeing across the board when it comes to the Democratic Party. They feel they have the momentum right now and that they can strike. Also, interestingly enough, Bob, I just want to mention this very quickly.
Please.
I spoke to someone from from Harris world. I got to get used to that. Same world. I got to get used to that. But the language, right? And from the Harris campaign world, who says we've been hearing a lot about this, the Trump and Vance are weird from Vice President Harris, from her allies, from surrogates. And that was early on a tactic they utilized because they felt that that the Trump campaign did not do a good job of defining JD Vance. So they saw an opening, almost Trumpian in this tactic. By defining him, they saw they had the op on him, they did the vetting on him, and they were ready. And so I think by issuing that, and especially early on, it's helped define him so far. And it's going to be, you've seen already Vance and the campaign have some struggles in sort of defeating that sense of him being weird, for lack of a better description.
And we have a minute left. What's your latest reporting on the VP search and how Democrats you've spoken with are talking about it?
Well, they're well aware that they have to be able to fill whatever it is that Joe Biden is leaving behind. And so, sources say she has to choose somebody that can ensure that those people who wanted to vote for Joe Biden are still going to come along and then some. So something that she is not. I mean, this is a former DA of San Francisco. The Trump-Vance team already painting her as the most progressive, radical in their words, presidential nominee ever. And so perhaps a more moderate figure would fit the bill. When you look at these people, there are a lot of those that could do the job. But again, who is going to balance her out in a way that can really be a winning ticket? Nobody really knows, Robert, except for Vice President Harris and probably Doug Emhoff, her husband.
I don't know. I'm not sure Doug's read in. We'll have to do some reporting on that. Weijia Jiang and Finn Gomez, thanks so much for your reporting in time. As Vice President Harris is looking for that running mate, one consideration is how that pick might affect the presidential map. And Finn Gomez was just talking about that. We know after JD Vance was picked, there was speculation whether he might appeal to people in the industrial Midwest. For Vice President Harris, what would her map look like? CBS News Executive Director of Election and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now. So, Anthony, take us inside the map here. Let's say Senator Mark Kelly's picked. Does that actually bring in the Sun Belt? If Gretchen Whitmer's picked the governor of Michigan, does it actually bring in the industrial Midwest? Does she need to pick Josh Shapiro to win Pennsylvania? How do you see it based on our data?
Well, it's never too early, even though it's July, to break out that map, Bob. So this is a good reason to do that. Look, for context for everybody, these states in white are the 7 battleground states most likely to be the closest one, right? So anything maybe could tip the balance. And to understand the context on the math here, you mentioned, okay, Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania. If a Democrat, if Kamala Harris wins that, you mentioned Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan, okay? They win that and they win Wisconsin. These states all have a few things in common. One is a place where Democrats tend to do a little bit better with white non-college voters. Well, that gets you to 270. But in the same vein, like you mentioned, Donald Trump winning those, well, that, if JD Vance helps him do that, would mean that he would merely have to hold North Carolina to get over 279 there. So that's just one of many scenarios, Bob. But I will add this. By the way, I'll add this, too. You mentioned Mark Kelly in Arizona. I think that might speak to if Harris could take maybe a more southern route, different kind of coalition, more support from, say, minority voters, that part. Well, that would get her over 270 as well, including Arizona. But I can kick it back to you with this, Bob, talking about history. Arguably, do you have to go back to 1960, to LBJ, like you were mentioning, to think of a Democratic vice presidential pick that helped a presidential candidate, in that case Kennedy, deliver a state they might not otherwise have won? I don't know. Maybe historians will argue with me there. But that feels like it might be it, doesn't it?
It's an interesting point. I know JFK and RFK had some tense discussions about bringing LBJ in back in '60, and it was JFK's decision ultimately to do that. What about Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania? I mean, this is a state everybody's focused on. The vice president's there today. If Shapiro's picked, you've studied his coalition. What does he actually bring? He's from Montgomery County outside of Philadelphia. Does he actually put her over the top in Pennsylvania, or is it a toss-up?
I think we go back and we speak to two things. One is that coalition. Josh Shapiro, in winning in Pennsylvania, did outperform Joe Biden, did very well, again, especially with relative performance, white non-college voters. Democrats aren't likely to win that group. The question is whether they can keep their margins at or around the high 30s, 40-odd%. Question is whether that is a factor with Shapiro. And the other part of this is, for any presidential candidate, picking the vice president is often seen as the first big presidential decision that they make. So it's not just about states and geography, having been through all that, but it's also about how the wider electorate sees their decision-making process, Bob.
Anthony Salvanto at the map. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. We now want to take... President Biden is commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act at Lyndon Baines Johnson's Presidential Library. Let's listen in.
Thank you, Senator. Really. Thank you. Please. Please. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for that introduction, and above all, for your friendship over the years. There's literally one word that comes to mind every time I think of Andy Young. The word's integrity, absolute integrity. And thank you to the Johnson family for carrying forward the legacy of a truly great president and first lady. Your mom was incredible as well. The same goes to Mark Upgrove, president of the LBJ Foundation. It's great to be back here. I thank you all and distinguished guests gathered here today. Look, I was in college at the University of Delaware in our early beginning years when I heard the news of that President Kennedy had been assassinated. I remember exactly like anybody in my generation remembers exactly where they were sitting, standing, or walking. I was on the steps of one of the university halls called Hullion Hall at the university, listening on transistor radio with 3 other people. Seemed unbelievable. And then, later, watching President Johnson help the nation find a way forward. In his first address after the tragedy, President Johnson said, and I quote, "Nothing could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest passage of the Civil Rights Bill. That's what he said. As a kid coming up, I always admired President Johnson for his public service, whether it was as a school teacher in South Texas, master of the United States Senate, historic vice president and president. His philosophy was simple. In a great society, no one should be left behind. He'd say, it's time for us to come to see that every American gets a decent break and a fair chance to make good. And as Andy Young said, President Johnson met repeatedly with the civil rights leaders and built a coalition to bring that vision to life. And he did. He brought it to life. Over 50 years, the LBJ Foundation has convened this symposium to reflect one of the crowning achievements, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a defining moment that has since opened doors of opportunities for all Americans, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, national origin. Together with the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, these three landmark laws he signed are remarkable in their scale and their scope. Taken together, these three acts have made this nation fundamentally more fair, fundamentally more just, and most importantly, fundamentally more consistent with our founding principles. For real. And we're a better nation because of them. We must be clear. Their work, our work, is not done. It's not done. We do not celebrate these laws as part of our past, but as critical components of our future. President Johnson understood what President Lincoln understood in his own time, that the courts would determine the scale and scope of our laws. Over 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, President Johnson vowed, in his words, to do this job that Lincoln started, by challenging the court to live up to its constitutional responsibility. He did that by nominating Thurgood Marshall as the first black justice of the Supreme Court. And by aggressively defending civil rights throughout the courts. But now, we live in a different era. In recent years, extreme opinions that the Supreme Court has handed down have undermined long-established civil rights principles and protections. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County case gutted the Voting Rights Act, opening the floodgates to a wave of restrictive voting laws that have seen states across the country pass. In 2022, the court overruled Roe v. Wade and the right to choose that had been the law of the land for 50 years. 50 years. The following year, the same court eviscerated affirmative action, which had been upheld and reaffirmed for nearly 50 years as well. And now, there's an extreme movement and agenda called Project 2025. Well, by the way, they're serious, man. They're planning another onslaught attacking civil rights in America. For example, Project 2025 calls aggressively attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion all across all aspects of American life. This extreme MAGA movement even proposes to end birthright citizenship. That's how far they've come. End birthright citizenship, which if you're born in America, you're an American citizen. That's how extreme these guys are. This issue and so many other civil rights that Americans take for granted are likely to come before the court in the years to come. And most recently and most shockingly, the Supreme Court established in Trump versus the United States a dangerous precedent. They ruled, as you know, that the President of the United States has immunity for potential crimes he may have committed while in office. Immunity. This nation was founded on the principle there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law. And for all practical purposes, the court's decision almost certainly means that the president can violate their oath, flout our laws, and face no consequences. Here's what Justice Sotomayor, Supreme Court Justice, wrote in her dissent, and I quote, "Under the majority's reasoning, the president now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders a Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law." Just what Justice Sotomayor wrote in her dissent. Folks, just imagine what a president could do in trampling civil rights and liberties given such immunity. The court's being used to weaponize an extreme and unchecked agenda. This decision is a total affront to the basic expectations we have for those who wield the power in this nation, that they are expected to be wholly accountable under the law. The president is no longer constrained by the law, and only limits on abuse of power will be self-imposed by the president alone. That's a fundamentally flawed view and a fundamentally flawed principle, a dangerous principle. On top of its extreme decisions, the court is mired in a crisis of ethics. These scandals involving the justices have caused public opinion to question the court's fairness and independence that are essential to faithfully carrying out its mission of equal justice under the law. For example, there are documented reports of a decades-long effort to reshape the judiciary, including the Supreme Court backed by shadow special interests that also support Project 2025. Undisclosed gift to justice is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from wealthy benefactors who have interest before the very court they're contributing to. Conflicts of interest from those connected to January 6th insurrectionists. And a blatant attack on nominating and confirming justices of the court itself. Do you all remember when Justice Scalia died in February of 2016? And the Republicans blocked the president's nomination, President Obama's nomination, to fill that vacancy for nearly a year by making up an entirely new standard that there be no confirmations of the court during an election year. But then, when Justice Ginsburg died in 2020, Republicans rushed through the President Trump's nominee at the very same time votes are being cast in an election that Trump would lose. It's outrageous. I know I don't look it, but I served in the Senate for 36 years, including as chairman and ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. I've been told that I've overseen more Supreme Court nominations as senator, vice president, and president than anyone in history, anyone alive today, I should say. I have great respect for our institutions and the separation of powers laid out in our Constitution. But what's happening now is not consistent with that doctrine of separation of powers. Extremism is undermining the public confidence in the court's decisions. As soon as I came to office, I convened a bipartisan presidential commission on the Supreme Court of the United States, comprised of leading constitutional scholars, both liberal and conservative, to provide recommendations on potential reforms to the court. I've been careful in these deliberations because these are serious, serious decisions. In the face of increasing threats to American democratic institutions, I use the Commission's analysis, and today I'm calling for 3 bold reforms to restore trust and accountability to the court and our democracy. As the press shouted to me as I got off Air Force One, the Republican Speaker of the House said, whatever he proposes is dead on arrival. Well, I think his thinking is dead on arrival. First, I'm calling for a constitutional amendment called No One is Above the Law Amendment. It holds, and I mean this sincerely, it holds that there's no immunity for crimes former president committed while in office. I share our founders' belief that the president must answer to the law. The president is accountable in the exercise of the great power of the presidency. We're a nation of laws, not kings and dictators. The decision can be boiled down to the title of one case, Trump versus the United States. The court asserted it was making a ruling for the ages. That isn't true. The court made a ruling for one, a former president. No other president in our history has asked for this kind of immunity for criminal actions. And no president, no former president, not me, not one, has and should have been given any exception to this with such immunity. The second thing I'm asking for, we've had term limits for presidents of the United States for nearly 75 years after the Truman administration. And I believe we should have term limits for Supreme Court justices of the United States as well. In fact, the United States is the only major constitutional democracy that gives lifetime seats in their high court. Term limits would help ensure that the court membership changes with some regularity. That would make timing for the court's nomination more predictable and less arbitrary. Reduce the chance that any single presidency imposes undue influence in generations to come. The bipartisan commission I convened analyzed various term limit structures. Based on their report, I believe the best structure is the 18-year term limit. That would help ensure the country would not have what it has now, an extreme court that's the product of an attack on the confirmation process that's been weaponized by those seeking to carry out an extreme agenda for decades to come. By the way, these guys mean it. These guys mean it. Project 2025 is real. They mean it. Third, I'm calling for a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's current ethics code is weak and even more frightening, voluntary. Any code of Congress must be enforceable. Under the reform I propose, justice would be required to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, recuse themselves in cases in which they or their spouses have a financial or other conflict of interest. Most people don't realize that Congress passed a law decades ago that says all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, have to recuse themselves in such cases. But the current justices insist on enforcing that requirement themselves without any public oversight or compulsion. See, that's their decision. They don't have to tell us how they made it. That might work if the court was actually enforcing those requirements, but they are not. The court is not self-policing. The court is not dealing with the obvious conflicts of interest. We need a mandatory code of ethics for the Supreme Court, and we need it now. My fellow Americans, based on all my experience, I'm certain we need these reforms. We need these reforms to restore trust in the courts, preserve the system of checks and balances that are vital to our democracy. There are also common sense reforms that a vast majority of the American people support, as well as leading constitutional law scholars, progressives, and conservatives. I look forward to working with the Congress to implement these necessary reforms. A number of members of Congress are here today. Let me close with this. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 just 2 days before the 4th of July. He said in that bill signing, and I quote, "This is a proud triumph. Yet those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secure only if each generation fought to renew in largest meaning," end of quote. That's what I've tried to do throughout my career, inspired by the cause of civil rights. That's what got me involved initially. My state was a state that was segregated by law. We were one who, only reason we didn't fight in the side of the South, we couldn't get there. I'm serious. What motivated me to be a public defender, a county councilman, I'll never forget, I had a good job with a big trial firm. And in Delaware, you have to study for the bar for 6 months before you're allowed to take it. And in the meantime, I was studying for the bar. That's when Dr. King was assassinated. We're the only state in the nation, city in the nation, that had the military stationed on every corner with drawn bayonets for 10 months, insisting, because we had a very conservative Democratic governor. In those days, when the Democrats won, they could choose to be part of the Southern Governors or Northeast Governors Conference. They choose the Southern Governors Conference lots of times. But guess what? It got me engaged. I love how reading these biographies of me now that I knew I was going to run for president. I remember walking in to the public defender's office, which was part-time at the time, and asking for an application because I wanted to join the public defender's office. And he looked at me, his name is Franny Kearns, he said, "Don't you work for Pickett Warburton Sanders?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why the hell would you want to do this?" Not a joke. But I said, "Let me do it." I became a public defender. Folks, here's the deal. Because I got engaged like a lot of you do, whether you run for office or not. You get engaged and you want to change things. So I kept trying to change the Democratic Party in my state, which is very conservative. And then a group of people came to me, as my senator knows, Chris Coons, came to me and said, "Look, we want you to run for state senate." I said, I can't go to Dover all the time. I'm just starting a law firm. I'm a part-time public defender. And then they came back to me and said, "Why don't you run for the county council?" I said, "I can't." They said, "You stupid SOB, it's right across the street there." I'm serious. It meets only twice a week. So my sister, my best friend, managed my campaign, and we picked a district that we couldn't possibly win. No Democrat had ever won. But my problem was I had my sister doing my campaign. And we won. Next thing I know, I was part of a group assigned as young senators, young elected officials, to try to bring the party around to get someone to run for the United States Senate. And I was put on a commission. When you're the young lawyer, you get to turn the lights on and off after every meeting. And so I remember going down to the Democratic convention, off year, in Dover, Delaware. And after the afternoon session, went back and I was in my room. There's a nice motel you just drive up to, get out and walk in your door there. And you know, an 8x10 bathroom, a shower, and a stall. And I had my towel around me and a shaving cream on my face, and I went bam, bam, bam at my door. And I thought it was the guys that came down with. The guy was had a talk show named Bob Cunningham, was a big civil rights guy, and two others. So I thought it was them. I walked, opened the door. There was a former governor, former Supreme Court justice, swear to God, the state chairman, and the former congressman. And they said, "We just had dinner." Well, I said, "I'm sorry, gentlemen." I walked in, I ran to the bathroom, shake the shave grip, thinking I could put something on. There wasn't anything there. I walked back out with a towel. I'm standing against a nail, a desk nail of the wall.
A lot of history right there. President Biden at the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, honoring the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. The president says the work for civil rights is not done. He also slammed recent rulings by the Supreme Court and unveiled his new proposal for reform at the High Court. This included calling for term limits on the Supreme Court. He's also now recounting some of his career in Delaware, going back to the early 1970s when he thought about running for U.S. Senate. What a career for President Joe Biden. We'll be back right after this. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
That Desired Farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Welcome back to America Decides. It's Vice President Kamala Harris and her allies are rallying in Pennsylvania this evening. President Biden making the case for Supreme Court reform in Austin, Texas. Let's bring in Pennsylvania Democratic State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. He is the Democratic nominee in the race to be Pennsylvania's next Auditor General. Great to see you. Thanks for being here on America Decides. This talk of Supreme Court, great to have you. Thank you. This talk of Supreme Court reform, you've run in Pennsylvania numerous times. You know the voters in Pennsylvania. What does this mean for activating the Democratic electorate and for the campaign at large in your state?
You know, part of what the president laid out so well today is the lack of trust and faith that folks have in the Supreme Court. You know, Pennsylvanians are pretty common sense folks. It doesn't make much sense that you have Supreme Court justices ruling on January 6 cases like Justice Thomas when his wife was actually, actively involved in a lot of the activities that we saw around January 6th. Justice Alito's wife was flying the American flag upside down in violation of the flag code. You have these justices, again, back to Clarence Thomas, who were taking trips from billionaires who have active cases before the Supreme Court and then ruling on cases. That doesn't make much sense. That smells of corruption. And frankly, the court has to not only be above reproach, but it has to be seen as being above reproach. This court is full of members that are the most extreme. And I don't think I'm speaking out of school here when I say that we will look back at the Trump versus United States of America case as one of the worst decisions since probably Dred Scott.
Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, do you believe he would put Pennsylvania in the Democratic column if he ended up on the ticket?
Listen, Josh Shapiro is a great friend. He's been an incredible governor. And the good news for us as Democrats is Vice President Harris has been vice president. And so she knows exactly what it takes to be the type of partner that she's been for President Biden for 3.5 years, getting important things done. But to go back to getting important things done, I've been able to do that with our governor the entire time he's been in office. Just a couple of weeks ago, we passed the single largest investment in K-12 education in Pennsylvania history. We just lowered the cost of prescription drugs by doing reforms of our pharmacy benefit managers. And so if the vice president wants a partner that can help her get things done, I think you have to look no further than Josh Shapiro. I serve in the only legislative body in the country that has a divided legislature. And so that means that we have to work across the aisle to get bipartisan solutions, but also it means we have to be unequivocal about leading in a way that makes life better for working people and working families. And I think the vice president has laid out a vision for working people and working families. And what she needs is a partner that can help her execute it. I think Josh Shapiro is well adept at doing just that.
And finally here, State Representative, when you look at the map of Pennsylvania, where do you believe Vice President Harris needs to spend the most time? Is it about rallying Democratic turnout in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh? Is it about trying to make inroads in central Pennsylvania, going up to Scranton, President Biden's hometown, and looking to really rally union members there? What's the top priority in your view?
Listen, I just got back from a 5-day, 10-county tour from Northwest Pennsylvania through the Pennsylvania wilds down to central Pennsylvania. And one thing we should not miss in this moment is the absolute excitement that the vice president has unleashed all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I was in some of the most rural parts of Pennsylvania where I spend a lot of time, where it's not easy to be a Democrat, where frankly, your life would be much easier if you just registered as an independent or a moderate Republican. But you have people who are being reminded by the vice president of their power to not just be shaped by events, but to shape events. And people are showing up in numbers that I've never seen. As you mentioned, I've run statewide before. I know a thing or two about Pennsylvania, and I know that this energy that we're seeing in this moment is like nothing we've ever seen before. The vice president is bringing our party together because that's what she's always done. And so I think the vice president is well equipped to win this state. But I think anybody who knows Pennsylvania knows if you want to win Pennsylvania, you better spend some time in Erie, you better spend some time in Northampton County, and you better be well positioned to get massive turnout in Philadelphia and the collar counties. And our vice president has visited all of those places, is well known, and is generating a type of enthusiasm in those communities that I have never seen in my entire, over a half decade being involved in elective politics.
State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta of Pennsylvania, thank you. We appreciate it. Now let's bring in our reporter panel, Molly Ball and Josh Gerstein. Molly is a senior political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Josh, a senior legal affairs reporter for Politico. Josh, I want to begin with you, and let's first listen to something Senator Lindsey Graham had to say on Face the Nation on Sunday.
Every day, Vance, it comes out Vance has done something more extreme, more weird, more erratic. Vance seems to be more erratic and more extreme than President Trump. And I'll bet President Trump is sitting there scratching his head and wondering, why did I pick this guy?
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. That's Senator Chuck Schumer of New York talking about JD Vance, taking his shot at JD Vance. Not unusual, but Senator Lindsey Graham said on Face the Nation that Supreme Court reform is dead on arrival in the Senate. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, used those exact words. What's your take on the legal aspect of what's being proposed here, Josh, by President Biden? 18-year term limits. Is this something that has a historic precedent? How do you see it as a legal reporter?
Well, I mean, it seems to me there's pretty formidable obstacles to any of this actually happening. And so I think that has to be acknowledged, like right off the bat. Even the White House is admitting that some of this requires a constitutional amendment to change the decision on immunity would require that. And some legal scholars think even the term limits proposal requires constitutional amendment. Unless the Senate drops its filibuster rule for legislation, it's going to be hard for any of this to actually take place. But I don't think that means it's not significant. I mean, because Biden was so strenuously opposed to this when it was proposed originally in the last campaign cycle. He pretty much gave a hard no on it, despite sort of taking some shots from people on the left because he gave a hard no on it. So for him to now say, well, I'm in favor of it, is a pretty significant reversal. And I think it does indicate that his thinking on the subject has shifted. His people will say it's because the Supreme Court has done things over the last 3.5 years to provoke him that they had not done before.
Molly, on a political level, he's not advocating, President Biden, to expand the court. And that's something many progressives would like to see. Critics call it packing the court. But he is calling for term limits, code of ethics. What's your read on it, that kind of proposal, what it means about where the president is politically in his final few months in his term?
Yeah, well, I think, as Josh said, he has not gone all the way to the left in terms of calling for court packing, but he has gone much further than anywhere that he has been in the past. And I think that says a couple of things. I think, first of all, the president proposed this at a time when he still expected to be the candidate, and he saw this as a political move that could help to energize the Democratic base. As Representative Kenyatta just testified to, that's not a problem that the Democrats feel like they have anymore, but it very much was a problem that presidential candidate Joe Biden was having as recently as a couple of weeks ago. And so to extend these sort of olive branches to the left was part of his strategy to try to increase that enthusiasm that he didn't really have for his own candidacy. But I do think that it also fits with the theme of his increasing concern about the structures of American democracy. And, a Republican like Lindsey Graham might say you can't claim to be concerned about the integrity of American institutions if you're involved in tearing them down. But from the perspective, I think, of many Democrats, it's the court that has violated longstanding norms and needs to be reined in by the other branches, and that's sort of what the separation of powers is all about.
Let's play a clip from former President Trump. He's talking to an evangelical audience, and he's talking about voting. Let's listen.
They all say, I think he's changed. I think he's changed since 2 weeks ago. Something affected him. No, I haven't changed. Maybe I've gotten worse, actually, because I get angry at the incompetence that I witness every single day.
And at that same event, he said, quote, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. Josh, you're a legal reporter. There's been this Supreme Court ruling on presidential power. Many critics of former President Trump look at his quotes at that rally, and they say this is a president who could be unbound if he wins another term. What's the significance of what the Supreme Court did, and what's your read as a reporter on the kind of presidency Trump's articulating could be on the horizon?
Well, I mean, my view on the decision that came out on immunity, which was on July 1st, which sort of feeds into all this, is that the sort of center block on the court, which we should stress is a much more conservative court than it used to be, so the center block is pretty conservative, decided they were far more concerned about the prospect of future presidents being harassed by criminal litigation or threats of criminal prosecution after they left office than they were basically about the Trump threat here, which is the possibility that he would intentionally do things that he was told was illegal while he was president. And, you know, that was one of the main concerns that was raised in front of the Supreme Court. And the three justices that are often seen as sitting closer to the center of the court, that would be Justice Kavanaugh, Chief Justice Roberts, and perhaps Justice Barrett, they all seem to be more concerned about that other issue of future prosecutions and presidents being encumbered than they were about sort of the worst interpretation of the comments that the former president recently made about there possibly being no need to vote for anyone after the current election cycle, which, if you take it in a literal sense, is obviously pretty ominous.
We have to leave it there. Molly, I can't believe I don't have time to ask you about the vice presidential search. I need the Molly Ball take. She'll have to come back soon. Please come back soon. Josh Gerstein, Molly Ball are two of our favorites. Meanwhile, President Biden has unveiled these plans for the Supreme Court. We'll take a closer look at his proposal. You're streaming America Decides.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now. We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Don't miss true crime anytime you want, anywhere you go. With the 48 Hours podcast. Real crimes, real lives, real justice.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Listen to 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
But with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Haitians are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's gonna be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm gonna remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was gonna be born, he was only gonna live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift, stream now on the free CBS News app.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
This is CBS.
President Biden, as you know, has been busy today touting his newly unveiled proposal to reform the Supreme Court. He did so in Austin, Texas. In doing so, he criticized the court's recent ruling granting former President Trump and any president's immunity for official actions while in office.
This nation was founded on the principle there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law. And for all practical purposes, the court's decision almost certainly means that a president can violate their oath, flout our laws, and face no consequences.
Joining us is Tom Dupree. He formerly served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President George W. Bush. Tom, great to have you here. Always good to talk with you. What do you make of the Biden proposals?
Well, politically, I think it's a non-starter. I can't imagine that surprises Biden or his allies to learn that the Republican response was that this is just not going anywhere. I think substantively, I guess what worries me a little bit is that these proposals for Supreme Court reform are being proposed in such an openly, transparently political context. Clearly, the president is upset at recent Supreme Court decisions, and he says, look, I want to kind of reset the membership, enact fundamental reforms. But the fact that this is being done in a politicized way so soon before the election makes me think that they may not be looking out for the best institutional interests of the nation in the Supreme Court, but rather trying to fire up the base and score some political points.
Democrats are concerned about Justice Clarence Thomas. They think he has been too cozy with his friends, and that remains an issue. As someone who served in the Bush administration in some capacity, how do you think conservatives react to that Democratic criticism?
Well, I think the conservatives often will say, look, how come ethics has now become a thing? In other words, conservatives will point to other situations where you had more liberal justices being involved in ethical issues or raising the same types of concerns, and you didn't see the same groundswell, at least on the left, for Supreme Court ethics reform. And so I think a lot of conservatives really see this as an attack on the conservative justices, on the conservative outcomes that have been prevailing lately in the Supreme Court, rather than a meaningful way to get reform. The court, of course, also just did adopt its own ethics code after coming under incredible pressure from all sides. They adopted it, and I think a lot of people say, give this a chance to work before we go to reform the court.
In the legal world, though, so this is the president in the executive branch proposing reform to the judicial branch. The judicial branch, some people have said, well, they shouldn't police themselves. Is there any other option for Supreme Court oversight? Is it Congress at the end of the day or not?
Well, if you're talking about just the structure of the Supreme Court and the way they govern their internal operations, I do think that is the Supreme Court's prerogative to make its own decisions. I mean, the Constitution creates the Supreme Court as our third branch of government, the judiciary. And so in that sense, it really is the court's prerogative to police its own house, decide how it's going to conduct its own operations, just as the Supreme Court wouldn't purport to instruct the president on how he must fulfill his executive duties or purport to direct Congress that they have to pass certain laws. There are certain things that each of the branches do by themselves. And although there can be regulation and there's always kind of a creative push and pull, I think at the end of the day, what's being talked here is the core function of the Supreme Court and how it organizes its internal affairs.
Among top attorneys in this country, is there a belief in private that eventually the court will expand and not just have 9 justices? Or is there a sense that it could very much become a bigger court with term limits in the near future?
I don't see it happening. I see the proposals continuing. I think when you have a slew of decisions that people on one side or the other don't like, there is going to be talk about expanding the court and changing its membership. But practically, I don't see it happening. We have had 9 justices for a long time. Justice Ginsburg famously said she thought 9 was the right number. It's not required by the Constitution. We've had times in our nation's history where we've had fewer than 9 justices, more than 9 justices, but the 9 membership has remained constant since the Civil War. And I think most people agree it's the right number. You become very cumbersome if you have a court with 20 or 30 people on it. 9 seems like the right number, and I think we're going to be sticking with it for a while.
And very quickly, who do you think the next justice to retire is?
Oh, my goodness. Well, it depends who wins the election. So we see that, then I think you can make a bet as who's going to retire next.
Oh, wait. We do actually have a minute left here. The term limits, what do you make of President Biden 18 years, putting that number in specifically as the guideline?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, look, I will say I'm not a big fan of Supreme Court reform by and large. I think the court as currently structured and formulated has served this nation very well for a long time. That said, look, I think term limits, I can see one advantage to it is that it really would untether the Supreme Court appointment process from the political process in a way that we don't have now, where you do have the fortuity of particular presidents getting to make multiple appointments. Some presidents don't get make any appointments, just depending on the timing of when people leave the court. So that would have the advantage of making it more regular. So you would know that every president will appoint 1, maybe 2 justices of his or her own choosing.
Well, President Biden keeps getting out there. I think we're going to keep hearing a lot about this Supreme Court proposal.
I think you're right.
But whether it's realistic politically, the Speaker said today it's dead on arrival. Senator Graham told me over the weekend, no way, no how. He works with Democrats on this. So we'll have to see how this all moves ahead.
We'll stay tuned. But
Tom Dupree will stick with CBS News. You see him all the time on our airwaves. And so we appreciate you stopping by. Thank you. Thanks. And that does it for us today. We are done. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.